I try to look at different perspectives. So I might read, Paul Johnson to get more like the conservative interpretive of history, and I might read somebody else to get a more liberal left-wing side. Then, you look at, to me, it's a matter of looking at all sides, applying your reason, your critical thinking abilities, and knowing, for example, how propaganda works, learning how to recognize it, because now propaganda is everywhere.
So let's talk about history. So for me, okay, so when it comes down to us, and studying history, you go to school, you read a book. You have to trust that's the history they're telling you. You're 13 years old, you're 12 years old.
Yeah.
You go home, you ask your mom and dad. If your mom and dad are like busy trying to make money and they forgot what they read 25 years ago,
yep,
they're like, babe, honey, I don't know.
Yeah.
Go Google something, right? Okay. Then you go to Google, okay? So you're studying history, then let's go to a museum. Okay, so we go to this museum. All right, who is funding the museum and who has influence over the museum? Is it the people that are giving it the money? So is the donors that have the control? Can archaeologists manipulate and confuse? Who can guess? Who do we trust when it comes? Is it just a writing? So when it comes down to history being told, how does one trust who's telling the real history of the events?
For me, it just comes down to looking at all sides of, I try to look at different perspectives. So I might read, Paul Johnson to get more like the conservative interpretive of history, and I might read somebody else to get a more liberal left-wing side. Then, you look at, to me, it's a matter of looking at all sides, applying your reason, your critical thinking abilities, and knowing, for example, how propaganda works, learning how to recognize it, because now propaganda is everywhere. It's prevalent. And it's all pretty much leading us to the mindset of accepting this authoritarian hierarchical structure of society. And, trust the experts. When it comes to COVID, trust the experts. When it comes to foreign policy, trust the experts. When it comes to climate change, trust the experts. And if you're not, a government-funded scientist, your opinion on climate change doesn't amount to anything. So for me, it's just a matter of critical thinking, using your reason, being skeptical, looking at all sides of an issue, and I think that we can sort it out. I've looked at the climate. I got interested in climate change, literally back in the 70s, and so I started studying it. And when about 1992, when the IPCC published its first report, I thought good, because by that time I had learned enough to realize that in the past there had been extreme climate changes on planet Earth, and we didn't have an explanation for that. Where I grew up in Minnesota was right at the edge of one of the great ice sheets that existed down till about 10,000 years ago. Well, so I got fascinated with that. I mean, we lived a rural life. We had property, we had acreage on a lake that was one of the puddles left over from the great ice sheets. Where we lived was right pretty much at the edge of the ice sheet. So the ice sheets would expand and contract. And without knowing specifically, I always had this sense about the landscape that there was something there. There was some kind of story there, that a hill wasn't just a hill, that a lake wasn't just a lake. And then later I came, about the time I got out of high school, I started, traveling around. I loved the outdoors. I camped and hiked all the time. So I kind of got to the point where I was like, okay, there's a story here, right? There's something that's interesting. Why is this, like, near our property, right on the edge of the lake? I used to play on it when I was a kid. It was a boulder, maybe about double the size of Rob's desk there. Big boulder, just sitting there, completely out of place. As I got older, I like, why is that rock sitting there? Like a lot of people, maybe it's just a rock, it's there, we don't need to know. But I was more like, why is that rock there? And then I told this story, I'll tell it again very quickly. 1969, there was the Minnesota River flows across southern Minnesota. It comes up and joins it's a tributary to the Mississippi River. And yeah, there it is right there. So if you come down, it's right up there where you see Big Stone Lake. Okay, that was the outlet. God, there's so much to get into here, man. That was the outlet of Glacial Lake Agassiz, which was this gigantic inland freshwater sea that was left over from the melting of the glaciers. And it burst out catastrophically right there at Big Stone Lake. And it's called Big Stone Lake because if you go there, there's these big old stones sitting out in the field randomly, and you go, okay, how'd these stones get there, right? So it was the summer of 1969. And
Randall, can you put the mic in front of you so the audience can,
I was summer of 1969, and there was a place called Flying Cloud Airport at Eden Prairie. Yeah, look at that. Okay, so at Eden Prairie, there was bluffs overlooking the Minnesota River Valley. And if Rob, can you pull up Google Maps and go to terrain view? And then once you've got that up, go to terrain view and then put in Eden Prairie, Minnesota. Now go to terrain view, which, there we go. Now let's see. Go to Eden Prairie, Minnesota, and then we're going to zoom out, and I'm going to show an example of what's called an underfit river. Let's see. I think we're a little, go south of there. Right there. Now zoom in right there where you're at on the river. Okay, pull it down a little bit to get it centered up. Pull it down. Okay, you see the river? Okay, so now go a little north of the river and you're going to see right there, you see the embankment?
Yes.
Okay, that's an embankment that's about 200 to 250 feet high. Right where that red dot is, if you go just to about maybe 2 o'clock, it's 1969. I'm standing up on top of the bluff, and I'm looking at the river down below me, right? And I see that river, and then I look beyond the river, and if you go south of the river, you're going to see another set of bluffs. They're not quite as prominent, but okay, you can see them. They're quite prominent. Right? Yeah, there they are. There's the other set of bluffs. Well, so I was standing there looking, and I had this epiphany. And the epiphany was as I'm looking down at the modern Minnesota River, and it's in its channel, and then I'm standing up on these bluffs, and I'm looking at, I could see another set of bluffs 3 miles away. And I had this epiphany, which was that, God, am I looking into a giant river valley here? Now, I didn't know anything about any of this, but it turned out that, yes, that's a gigantic river valley. And it was a river that was right there, 3 miles wide and 200 feet deep. And it was called Glacial River Warren. I learned later in the 80s, I learned that it was Glacial River Warren. And I also learned that the peak discharge of there it is, Glacial River Warren. It was, Lake Agassiz was formed from the meltwaters of the Laurentide ice sheet during the Wisconsin. Yes, there it is. That's the whole thing right there. And so, as it says, there was a prehistoric river that drained Lake Agassiz in central North America between 13.5 and 10,650. BP means before present. So, that river at its peak was 4,000 times greater than the modern Minnesota River. 4,000 times greater. And I didn't know, I had this impression. I was probably in an altered state of consciousness.
What were you smoking?
I don't remember. I don't know. Maybe Acapulco Gold. I don't remember that particular day. But knowing me back then, I probably was. Okay, so I confess. But the point was, that stuck in my craw for years, and after like a decade, in fact, after I'd become a Freemason, I mentioned that one of the brothers that signed my petition was writing a book. Well, his book was on catastrophism. And I was getting really, really interested in that because, again, I had learned about the ice ages, and God, really? What? There was, the whole of Canada was buried under 1.5 miles of ice. So were New York City, Detroit, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, Milwaukee, Madison, Minneapolis, Seattle, Portland, they were all buried under ice? Yes, they were buried under ice. And this is not long ago. This is between 10 and 25,000 years ago. So I just, I'm obsessively curious about stuff. So I wanted to know more about that. And that's when I discovered that science had no answer. Like, what caused the end of the Ice Age? Well, there were old assumptions based upon old models, which, based upon the energy requirements available. In order to melt the quantity of ice that was covering North America and Northwestern Europe, it was between 6 and 7 million cubic miles of ice. That's as much ice as now in Greenland and the South Pole together. So take the amount of ice that you've got now, South Pole, Antarctica, and Greenland, double that. And now we're back in the Ice Age. And so the old assumption was that took 30, 40, 50,000 years to melt away. Then radiocarbon dating comes along in the 50s and 60s, and by the 70s, enough data had been had come out that it was apparent that the disappearance of the appearance of the ice, the growth of the ice sheet, and the disappearance of the ice were way, way faster than anybody had ever imagined. There we go. So on the right, you see the Laurentide ice sheet. On the left, over Western Canada, you see the Cordilleran ice sheet, and then you've got the ice-free corridor in between them. So this would have been around 13,000 years ago. If you go back to
that's not a long time ago.
No, it's not a long time ago at all. Not in terms of Earth history. See, now we're getting to the mystery of it. This is not long ago at all. Now, when you had this much ice, now this is not even showing the ice over Northwestern Europe, but when you had this much ice, where did that ice come from? Well, it came out of the oceans, right? So to accumulate that much ice on land, you have to drop ocean levels by 400 feet. Now think about that. You're right here, Fort Lauderdale. If you drop ocean levels by 400 feet, what happens to the coastline? What happens to the beach? It ain't there anymore. In fact, I think from here on the east coast of the Florida Peninsula, I think you probably have to go 30 to 50 miles further east to get to the shoreline. So when that ice melted, then sea level comes up 400 feet. Now that's real sea level rise, 400 feet, compared to what the panic is now. Oh, it might raise another 6 inches in the next century, or 8 inches, I think. Of course, the projections are based upon, in my opinion, faulty computer models.